Hi everyone. My name is Ashley and I'm one of the co-coordinators for the Professional Development and Self-Awareness program at the Columbia School of Social Work. It is my honor to have you all here today, especially Dr. Joseph Gahn, to give us this really meaningful webinar to us who are social work students and emerging social workers and clinical practitioners. So before we start and give an introduction, I'm gonna pass it off to not Dr. John Louis, my co-coordinator, John Louis, so he can also introduce himself and the rest of my team. And then I'll go ahead and give an introduction to everyone about Dr. Joseph Gahn. John Louis, do you wanna introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jean Louis. I'm also a co-coordinator for PDSA and just excited about today. Thank you so much, Dr. Gahn, for joining us as well, too. And for all those participating online from all across the country and in New York City. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am currently on Quinnipiac land. Dean Karma, would you like to introduce yourself as well, too?
Thanks, Jean-Louis and Ashley. Hi, everyone. My name is Carmelo. I'm the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the School of Social Work, and it's my honor and pleasure to work with the coordinators for PDSA, Ashley and Jean-Louis. And Dr. Gahn, I just want to join them in welcoming you and thanking you for joining us today to share your knowledge, particularly during this important month as we try to honor Native American Indigenous heritage. And we are also joined by my co-conspirator, Chris Wan. Here he is. I'm going to pass the mic to him before we pass it off to our speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Wan, he, them. I'm the program coordinator for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And it is definitely my honor as well and humbling privilege to be able to share this space in which Dr. Joseph Gahn will be sharing his wisdom with our community and beyond. And I'm currently on Lenape lands, and my peoples are from the Korean Peninsula of the Han peoples. And I'm of the Wonju clan. Thank you, everyone. And I'll be providing any technical assistance. So if you have any questions, please let us know by private messaging.
All right, so without any further ado, I will give you all Dr. Joseph Gahn's biography. And personally, this is a great honor to have you here today because I learned and read about you through one of my professor's classes this semester. She's actually present today, Dr. Mikalopoulos, and because of her inclusion of your work, I got to learn about your work on historical trauma in Indigenous communities to this day and in history. So thank you so much for being here today. And my heart is like beating so fast because I'm so like excited to see you here. Okay, so to give you all his biography, Dr. Joseph P. Gahn is an international expert in the psychology and mental health of American Indians and other Indigenous peoples. A professor at Harvard University, Dr. Gahn has collaborated with tribal communities for 25 years to critique conventional mental health services and harness traditional culture and spirituality for advancing Indigenous well-being. He has published 85 scientific articles and chapters and received recognition in his fields through several fellowships and career awards, including a year-long residency at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. A graduate of Harvard College and the University of Illinois, Dr. Gahn also trained at Dartmouth College and McLean Hospital / Harvard Medical School. He is currently a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and of 7 divisions of the American Psychological Association. An enrolled member of the Ani Gros Fantra tribal nation of Montana, he also served briefly as a chief administrative officer for the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. In 2014, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. So please give a round of applause to Dr. Joseph Gahn. Yay.
Thank you. That's a very kind introduction, and it's nice to make all of your acquaintances. I've never had, 4 folks weigh in at the beginning. That's really exciting. I'm glad to have met you. And before I start today, I should tell you that I'm talking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Cambridge and Harvard, much of Harvard sits in the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. I am from Montana originally, as you heard, and my families are from the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana. Specifically on my dad's side, we're from the Azure and the Brisboe families. And on my mom's side, we're from the Gone and the Crazy families. I carry my mom's last name, of course, and it's kind of lucky, I guess, that she didn't hyphenate her last name, or I'd be a psychologist named Dr. Gone Crazy, which may make it difficult to attract clients. I'm very pleased to talk to you today. My understanding for the structure is that I'll talk to you for a brief 20 or 25 minutes maybe. Then we'll have shift to a kind of facilitated discussion, and then we'll open it up for exchange and questions. So if that seems to be a plan that will work, what I'll do now is I'll share my screen and go into a bit of PowerPoint guidance as I talk to you about some things, just to put issues on the table for us to consider today. So now, terrific. Can you all see this, I hope? As you can see, I've titled this bit, The Post-Colonial Predicament for American Indian Mental Health Services, Early Career Lessons. You'll notice the post in post-colonial is in parentheses. And that's because there are ways in which indigenous communities in the United States are colonial still and post-colonial in some other senses. So it's a bit ambiguous and arguable as to whether colonial is a better term, post-colonial is a better term. And I'm just trying to bracket that that is an actual open for debate. So, you know, just in terms of getting, again, some stuff on the table for us to consider and to frame how my career has unfolded with respect to indigenous mental health, I want to just describe for you some early career experiences I had that really set the agenda and the foundation for how I think about and approach community mental health for indigenous folks. As you are all well aware by now, there are mental health disparities or inequities among American Indian populations. We have epidemic levels of distress in many of our communities. Particularly, we contend with high prevalences of trauma and substance abuse, suicide. And yet the mental health services that are on offer, predominantly supported through the Indian Health Service, a federal agency, are really underfunded. You know, it used to be that it was maybe 40 cents on the dollar compared to what other federal employees would receive for health coverage. I think it's gotten a little better than that lately, but still nowhere close to parity. And so we really have a large unmet need when it comes to mental health concerns in Indian country. So one might imagine in looking at this state of affairs that, you know, the solution seems straightforward. On the one hand, we have these pronounced mental health problems. On the other, we have these underfunded mental health services. So we just need proper funding and opportunity to expand the mental health services in ways that can better meet the needs of our communities. It makes perfect sense, right? But, you know, I'm not so sure that's the only way to think about this. And this is where I want to take you all back to a formative research experience I had pretty early in my career. This is in the 1990s still, in which I went home to the Fort Belknap Reservation to try to explore links between culture, coloniality, and distress in more anthropological fashion. That is, I went to try to bracket, set aside my own professional mental health training and my own socialization into how mental health professionals think and talk about these issues in order to instead engage in open-ended interviewing at home on the reservation. This open-ended inquiry was really discovery-oriented and focused on a particular extended family group, because what I really wanted to get at was not how people's experiences fit into stock professional categories and concepts and so on, but rather to try to better understand among my own people local construals, understandings, explanations when it comes to coloniality, culture, drinking, and depression. In anthropological terms, these are often referred to as trying to discern or uncover explanatory models, the ways in which people in given locales and settings make sense of, often in shared and patterned ways, their own experiences of distress. And particularly was interested also in maybe uncovering any idioms of distress. An idiom of distress are ways that people might experience and express their distress in ways that might differ quite a bit from how professionals talk about that. So somatization and forms of somatization might be a kind of idiom of distress in many communities around the world. I ended up focusing this research, again, in the late 90s, on a case study with an individual who wanted to go by his Indian name and the work we did together. His Indian name was Traveling Thunder. And Traveling Thunder was a middle-aged, monolingual, English-speaking Assiniboine Gros-Ventre tribal member. And he was a grassroots activist who particularly took on some of the environmental concerns of the reservation. We had a gold mine that was polluting the water supply just off the southern end of the reservation. And importantly, he was a self-identified traditionalist. What I mean by a traditionalist is that he was really looking back to indigenous culture, tradition, ceremony, spirituality, and sacred activities as an important part of what it means to be Indian today. He pretty overtly rejected Christianity. The Fort Belknap Reservation has long had Roman Catholicism as an important institution. This was not something that he found compelling or appropriate. And in some ways, he came of age in the Red Power movement of the 1970s and really, adopted a lot of these perspectives and views from that era. He was important to talk to because he was one of the few people I interviewed who did not have a lot of firsthand experience with mental health and clinical activity down at the IHS clinic. So he was interesting precisely because he would bring a perspective that was not necessarily so deeply engaged or even entangled in those approaches. And what's interesting is that in discussing and describing the relationships between culture, coloniality, problem drinking, and depression, he really offered an explanatory model or a discourse of distress in which he described 4 different historical eras by way of explanation. So that's what I want to review for you next. He first talked about an era of paradise almost, the era of pre-colonial existence that he described as follows. Quote, "See, there was no alcohol on this continent 500 years ago. There was no drugs. There was no problems, no domestic problems, no social problems. Everything was good because everybody lived according to custom and teachings. And there was no jails, no hospitals, there was no prisons, no insane asylums. There was none of that stuff because everybody lived according to a strict custom." And so you see here that Traveling Thunder, in describing this era of pre-colonial existence among indigenous peoples, that he talked about a perfect harmony and balance among people in that way of life, owing specifically to strict observation of custom, indigenous custom. Of course, this era of pre-colonial existence did not last. He talked then about a second era, the era of colonial contact or conquest, if you will, which he described as follows. Quote, "But when the white man came, they forced the Indian people to get rid of their way, their religious spiritual beliefs. They forced them to trade their economy, which was based on the barter system on living off the land, the wildlife, fish, and the herbal medicines. Then they turned around and forced their culture on them, their religion, their beliefs, their foreign ways onto them by taking all the young people out of homes and putting them away in boarding schools and forcing the white man's teachings on them. It's genocide." And so he refers now to a period of colonial subjugation in which, indigenous savagery needed to be replaced by enlightened modern civilization. It led to the whole boarding school movement, which you probably are familiar with, in which indigenous young people were coercively placed in government and church-run boarding schools, industrial schools, where the goal was to, quote, "kill the Indian, save the man," unquote. And so what he's really indexing or invoking here is a recognition of the annihilation of the custom that had prevailed in pre-colonial times. This led, according to Traveling Thunder, to a third era, an era we might describe as one of loss, in which the post-colonial effects are really rampant in our communities. He described this as follows, quote, "If you don't know your own true oral history, your true oral traditions and customs, and where you come from, and what's supposed to be important to you, well, you're going to feel empty. You're going to feel like you don't belong, because we don't fit in with the white man's system. We never did, and we never will. It basically boils down to pride. If people ain't proud of who they are, where they come from, what they're doing, then they're going to be doing these things: alcohol, drugs. And once you're into alcohol and drugs, you're going to probably get into a depression, and you're going to not feel worthy of being a human being, and you're going to want to kill yourself." And so in this era of post-colonial loss, Traveling Thunder kind of invokes what we might recognize as a form of psychological anomie. Anomie means no norms, no laws, no rules, a kind of breakdown in all that gives purpose, shape, meaning, and structure to a good life. And it's this that leads to pathology. And specifically, it's the, quote, "white man system," unquote, as he referred to it in other parts of our interview, that is the pathogen, that is the origin of the problem in ways that he described this. Now, fortunately, Traveling Thunder didn't think this was the end of this particular historical unfolding. In fact, he talked about a fourth era, the era of revitalization or potential post-colonial remedy, again emerging in the Red Power movement of the 1970s. Here's what he had to say about this. Quote, "After we looked around and realized that we left something behind, we started going back to the hills to fast. We started going to the sweat lodges to pray and to sweat. We started going to the elders to learn. We never was happy living like a white man. I would give the credit to the Creator and to the spirit world for pitying the people to allow us to get our sacred traditions back. To me, what that ceremony does is you're calling on the Creator, the spirit world, for life, or for a good heart, or for a good, clean mind, an alcohol and drug-free mind, or you're calling on the spirit world for guidance, or for survival even survival." And so in Traveling Thunder's view, this fourth era of potential revitalization really involved this return to the very sacred custom that kept things in harmony and balance prior to the colonial encounter. In some ways, it's a cycling back and a recovery and reclamation of that sacred custom for benefit for people today. And so just to abstract a little bit, to try to talk about Traveling Thunder's explanatory model, one thing that's clear is that he identified a very clear pathological process when it came to problem drinking and depression in our community. He talked about cultural repression through the white man system that would lead then to a kind of psychological anomie that would then lead to substance abuse and to depression and to worthlessness and to suicide. And you can see that many of these links traced out exactly in the words that I quoted. So even the actual chain here really comes from his own words. Interestingly, Traveling Thunder offered very little elaboration of personal distress. He didn't really focus on individuals, and he didn't talk about the usual things that are familiar to mental health professionals with respect to the origins of these kinds of problems. He offered a relatively non-biological, non-psychological account. He didn't talk about genetics. He didn't talk about brain chemistry. He didn't talk about early childhood or abuse or neglect. He talked essentially about history, about culture, and about spirituality, and about coloniality. So these are really the things that he emphasized in this explanatory model, in contrast to how mental health professionals usually think and talk about these issues. Moreover, he really accentuated and highlighted the pathogenic aspects of the white man system. He was identifying colonization as the cause of native distress. He emphasized systemic factors over intrapersonal factors. Again, not things about you and your psychology and your background and your history, but stuff about the context of society, coloniality, and so on. He emphasized shared community vulnerabilities. This isn't about this person or that person. It's about all of us who've gone through this history and have, as a result, these kinds of problems arising. And I want to draw your attention, therefore, to historical trauma, because in most respects, what Traveling Thunder is setting out is identical to what has come to be known as historical trauma throughout research on Indigenous mental health concerns, but also everywhere you go in Indigenous communities, not just here in the US, but in Canada, increasingly in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Now, there is one distinction that I'll just bracket as an aside, because maybe you'll want to talk about it later. He did not mention trauma, psychological trauma. And as I said, he offered a pretty apsychological account. And so he didn't have the kind of psychological mindedness that would have emphasized or accentuated the traumatic aspects of this history. And I think that's important and interesting to bracket and maybe revisit later. Well, you might wonder, in the way I did, what then is the relevance of clinical psychosocial interventions in mental health services? And so I asked Traveling Thunder, I said to him, I get this. I'm wondering, though, under what conditions, if you had a loved one really suffering, you were worried about them, under what conditions would you take that person down to the Indian Health Service mental health clinic and get them some counseling or some help in that clinic? Well, he grew quiet at that moment. And I think we paused for 10 seconds while he gathered his thoughts. And when he resumed, he spoke very soberly. And here's what he had to say in response to that question. I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. You look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future where the white man's leading you, I guess you could make a choice. Where do I want to end up? And I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrist in the Indian Health Service and say, well, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that'd be a choice each individual will have to make. And so in these words, Traveling Thunder attributed mental health treatment as obviously a cross-cultural encounter, but not only merely the neutral ground of differences meeting, but really that mental health services might even function as a kind of implicit form of Western or modern cultural proselytization. Proselytization is like missionary work. And in fact, when I talk to other audiences, including Indian audiences, I sometimes suggest that mental health professionals might be the missionaries for a new millennium when it comes to its relationship to modernity and what these services can end up inadvertently sometimes promoting among Indigenous people. And there are those like Traveling Thunder for whom that stands in as a form of brainwashing, and they're not interested in that. They reject and resist it. So returning to the post-colonial predicament, which again is lots of need, inadequately funded services. The idea that maybe we just need to expand mental health services might not be such a simple and straightforward solution. We have the problem of cultural difference that Indigenous people and the traditions that give rise to the psi disciplines like psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and so on, psychiatry, come from historically distinctive cultural enclaves, and that those differences do persist even today in certain cultural practices. And in my own home communities, there are kind of religious, sacred, or cosmological understandings that still persist in at least some fragmented form. And those give rise and are tied to or linked to certain forms of cultural psychology or ethnopsychology that you can point out. And I've written some things that have tried to delve more deeply into those connections. In the end, the culture of the mental health clinic is not the culture of the American Indian or Indigenous community. And so there is this cultural difference. But as I said, it's not just an issue of neutral meeting of different perspectives and viewpoints. It's all situated within this longstanding problem of cultural dominance, that Indian people have been subject to centuries of colonial subjugation, that in the boarding school era, you know, the phrase was very overt, kill the Indian, save the man. That it was about civilizing savages, that old cultural orientation or tradition was primitive and undesirable and unsuitable or unfit for the modern world. And so all of that cultural stuff had to be eradicated was the presumption. And all of this endures today through power asymmetries that persist in really important and marked ways. So back to the post-colonial predicament. On one hand, we have quite urgent community needs. Too many Native people live in impoverished, high-risk settings. There are these documented disparities in mental health status. On the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer are, at least for a swath of our population, not everyone, of course, there's a lot of diversity, but for a swath of our population are incongruent. For people like Traveling Thunder, they actually seem like an invitation to, quote, brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. And this incongruence is attested to not just by community anecdotes with people you talk to or the uptake of historical trauma, for example, but by research evidence that has systematically really been able to tap into this thing. So I think of the work of Les Whitbeck and Melissa Walls, who were working with a number of Anishinaabe communities in the Great Lakes region. They went and asked for service preferences among people who might have mental health concerns or crisis. You know, rank order all of the different ways you might seek help in the context of a mental health crisis. And, you know, professional help was not even in the top 10. You know, so there are lots of other things that people would prefer or want to do long before they would seek out a mental health specialist for these kinds of problems. All of this in the course of my career has signaled and anchored an entirely alternative or alternative Indigenous discourse about mental health. In some ways, it's a parapsychiatric discourse. It engages with the concerns of psychiatry, even as it departs and diverges and promotes an alternative to it. And there's really four domains I'm pointing out here: the domain of what the problem is, the domain of what the aspiration is, the domain of what intervention is about, and the domain of evaluation when it comes to those interventions. And so when it comes to something like even the problem, it's not mental disorders, the kind you would find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and all the way we classify mental health conditions, but historical trauma. that is said to be the problem. The aspiration, the thing you're desiring or hoping or trying to be restored to in terms of wellness and well-being, is not neoliberal individualism, in which free agents navigate free markets in pursuit of autonomous happiness and wealth, but indigenous forms of self and personhood that are related much differently in kinship and to non-human beings and even to local ecologies and landforms in ways that can be quite distinctive. The domain of intervention is not about empirically supported treatments. Most Indian people who are advocates and gatekeepers for mental health aren't that enthralled by empirically supported treatments or the latest, greatest that science has supported. In fact, they tend to say, we don't need those. Our culture is our treatment. And by that, I think they mean that there's interest in reclaiming indigenous healing or therapeutic practices and engaging in sacred ceremony and those sorts of things, that's the intervention we need to remedy our ills, not the latest, greatest from ingenious psychological scientists and psychiatric researchers and so on. Finally, in the fourth domain, even the ability to evaluate what treatments are useful, helpful, or work is not really a concern with the scientific studies and with what research evidence and rigorously controlled trials might show. But increasingly, there's this interest and emphasis on indigenous ways of knowing, on drawing on a kind of indigenous epistemological traditions. There's even an effort in Native and Indigenous studies to kind of formulate these into forms of indigenous research methodologies that might look different and function differently than the research as usual in university settings. So I've tried just to give you a little bit about some stuff I encountered early on in my research career by way of setting a foundation for a conversation and discussion that we might have next. I've written a lot about these things to try to trace different parts of it out in different publications, and most of those are available on my website here if you are interested in further information after we're done talking today. So now I'll turn it to stop sharing my screen and close out my PowerPoint. And I'm eager for this next phase of, I guess, a kind of facilitated dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gan. Much appreciated. I really appreciate you sharing your research and those early lessons. So as you probably know, so first of all, social workers are the largest number of mental health service providers, and the profession as a whole is predominantly white, right? So, one of the key questions from our audience is for those who are white identified or white passing folks, how, from their positionality, how do they navigate providing services to Indigenous communities or American Indian communities?
Yes, thank you. So, there are maybe 3.5 million Indigenous people. We'll find out more when the census results come out, of course, because it always jumps every 10 years in ways that birth rates can't actually account for. So there's what we might refer to as racial transit happening when it comes to Indigenous identification through different ways of the census. But in any case, when it comes, Indigenous people obviously have migrated and participated in urban life for a very long time. There used to be a Bureau of Indian Affairs program that was designed to solve the Indian problem, of people segregated on reservations and dependent on federal assistance and so on, in ways that systematically moved Indian people to cities to try find new lives there where they would have jobs and all of that. And this was really in the 60s and the 70s, and it didn't work so well. People ended up circling back at different points and what have you. But nevertheless, there's a lot of Indian people don't live in identifiable Indian communities. So one thing to note is that when you're talking about a place where you might actually work in services that are dedicated for, it's settings in Indian reservations or in urban Indian health organizations, health clinics, where you're most likely to find that. And that stuff is funded by the Indian Health Service predominantly, not solely, but predominantly. It depends on a lot, certainly Indian care providers, although that's usually at the social work level, less so at the psychologist level, almost never at the psychiatrist level. But it also depends on white people, rolling up their sleeves and getting to work in those settings in important ways. And so, the thing I would want to do is perhaps reframe a little bit away from like who you are to what you do. And I think the thing is less about, being white as more about how you think about and are able to interact with Native people in ways that are respectful, that are acknowledging of expertise on their end and their part, on being open to learning and to correction and to feedback, on taking some time to try to be open to learning and making yourself available to learn and to be engaged. So I know that some of the complaints we have about non-Native people who work in the Indian Health Service or who work in our tribal community sometimes is that they're there, but they're not really there. They come into the office and they see clients, you know, for the client hours all week long, but you never see them at the powwow. You never see them sitting at the shopping mall or wherever talking with people nearby. You know, so there's kind of almost like they go there to work and that's it. Their social life is not really intersecting at all. Now, of course, that's not everybody, but it's enough people that it's a critique of non-Native providers in the Indian Health Service. Sometimes people are really they almost convey the feeling that they're really there to get their loan payoffs for their expensive doctoral education, and then they're out of there. And the learning curve is steep enough that, you know, if you're only there 2 or 3 years, it's pretty hard to develop what would be most useful in these fronts. But I think that conveying and signaling respect, interest, openness, and all the usual things that in some ways are clinical skills is kind of the way to proceed. But it does require, I think, more time than you're going to sit in your office and see people one by one.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned in your talk, there seems to be this level of distrust even with the services that are provided through the Indian Health Services. And so how do we sort of build that trust or sort of break through using traditional methods of mental health services and sort of respecting and integrating sort of indigenous healing practices? Again, as you sort of mentioned in your talk, that folks you said that of the top 10 things, like professional help was nowhere near that they really wanted to reclaim sort of Native customs. And so how do non-Native practitioners integrate that into their practice without it feeling like cultural appropriation, you know, with it really feeling genuine in that practice?
Yeah. You know, I'm not sure you integrate it into your practice. I think what happens is you reach out and collaborate with other people who are also engaged in therapeutic activity, but maybe not in a licensed, credentialed, professional manner in the way that's recognized by the healthcare system. So rather than trying to figure out how to incorporate it into your own practice, these kinds of things, I think it's probably better to think about how do you coordinate and collaborate with local change agents and therapists and healers and sacred people in ways that you collaborate. So you have your domain that you're trained in, they have what they do, and you kind of work together perhaps in coordinating patient care if they're open and willing to do that, which totally depends again on your attitude and how much time you're willing to spend to get to know them and so on. So I think that's one way. And the other thing I think is just to be very clear-eyed about what mental health services can and can't offer. The ills of Indian country are not going to be remedied by mental health services, no matter how much we have, no matter what kind it is. You know, we are in reeling from the colonial encounter, and there are things that happen as a result of the longstanding impact and legacy of those things that have distorted and disrupted family life. So if you're a young person who's growing up in a family that's afflicted with substance use or something, and you're not getting your parents in almost any situation, they love their children, but your parents weren't able to be there for you in ways when you were very young to create that nurturing attachment that we all need and require. If that's the case, let's face it, 12 sessions of mental health aren't going to fix that. You know, it's just, there's things that can't be fixed by these kinds of services, but there are things that can. So it's just being really sober and clear about what you can offer, recognizing that the ills of Indian country vastly outdistance what mental health can provide. What we really need, of course, are really deep structural alterations in how Indian life it can remedy the legacy of colonization. You know, but those things are not the things that the government funds. You know, government funds services at this point, and not that well, as you've heard. So we have to work with what we can, and there is a role to play. So collaboration, coordination, I think being present. I mean, the fact is, many people are just not going to come to the door for help that they're voting with their feet. It doesn't make sense to them. That's one way. But it's a striking number of Native people in our communities who end up in mental health services that are there kind of by mandate. The court has said, your life's out of control. You're not going to get your kids back till you go for help. Or, the family is so desperate and doesn't know what else to do with someone who's killing themselves through addiction that they, get a court order to place them into treatment. And so that's even trickier when you have someone who's kind of mandated or coerced to be there. That's state power being made felt in ways that would make traveling funders' concerns even more salient, I would think, about the issue of brainwashing. So that requires even more sensitivity. But I think a lot of it, again, has to do with the relationships. That's the thing. It's back to, if people are wary and unfamiliar with you and what you have to offer, there's some swath this just doesn't make sense and they don't want it, so they're never going to come. But there's a swath for whom it could make sense, and it might make sense if they can understand it better and feel like you're a trustworthy person. So, it's about reaching who is there to be reached, but it requires these attitudes and willingness to be out there, get to know people, be approachable, and so on. That will make the difference.
So it sounds like almost sort of putting your clinical hat to the side and not approaching the person, directly from like, I'm here to diagnose or intervene or treat you, but really just getting to know you as a human being first. And then as we build that relationship, saying, hey, how can I help you, or how can I support you on this journey, right, to address these challenges? Am I hearing that?
Yeah, I think that's well put. And I also think it's, how can I be helpful? And recognize that maybe you can't. That it might be worth a try, and that maybe there's something you can work out, but it might not work out because maybe the help the person needs or wants just isn't what you have to offer. And maybe they spend some time getting to know what you have to offer and even trying it out and realize that's not it. Because I think, again, the thing to know is that the culture of the clinic is not the culture of the community, as I said, which is to say that mental health services and all the training we get, all of that stuff is embedded and dependent on cultural orientations and assumptions. Psychotherapy and counseling tend to depend on psychological mindedness. Psychological mindedness have been developed, and there's a great article by Lawrence Kerr-Mayer on psychotherapy and the cultural concept of the person that I recommend you all read. But one of the things is that psychological mindedness is this set of orientations to when we are willing to take ourselves as a kind of project that we have responsibility for managing and cultivating. It's kind of a reflexive term that it requires you to think, I have responsibility for who I am and who I become, and it's something I need to manage. That's an aspect of psychological mindedness. That there's stuff going on inside or in my interior life that is important to know, and that I can delve into there and get greater understanding and great knowledge if I do that. That we are actually have deep interiors, and that ideally they're richly furnished. But we have to spend time. It's a project to undertake to do that. The idea that expressive, self-referential talk is meaningful and important and useful and healing. Those are all part of psychological mindedness. And I would submit to you that many, if not even most people around the world, are not particularly psychologically minded in terms of their kind of resting, comfortable, familiar way of interacting. And so psychotherapy and the sciences or the psi disciplines in particular depend on and promote and cultivate that for people. And it's back to who wants it and how useful is it. And that kind of psychological mindedness, we might say, arose in the West because of great affluence. It comes with individualism. That egocentricity becomes a form of an orientation of the self. And there are other orientations of the self outside of that don't resonate as well with the sciences, so to speak.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about, particularly with references to historical trauma and sort of the indigenous healing practices about what's happening in African or African-American communities. I mean, do you see sort of a crossover there, or sort of a shared path with respect to not just reclaiming healing practices, but also not trusting, or sort of the applicability of sort of these traditional psychotherapy models that really don't work or are not embraced in Black or African-American communities?
Yeah, I think that there are overlaps, although I think there are also distinctive configurations. So it's interesting that the more you try to cover diversity, the higher order of abstraction you need to go to cover those things. And at some point, the order of abstraction is so high that it's not that illuminating anymore. But I think in this case, social class is another one. But I think what African Americans contend with that American Indians maybe do so less, to a lesser degree, is the intense process of racialization and the anti-Black prejudice that is, everywhere in our society, including in Indian communities. I mean, so there are really stiff challenges around that Indian people have been allowed to marry into whiteness historically. And that's a different experience than if Black people historically have not been allowed to marry into whiteness. And so those are fundamental differences that I think are really important to take stock of. So I remember being on a panel at Michigan where we were all talking about, we were brought together as psychologists who study race. And so we were talking about what it means to study race. And, I and the Asian Americanist and the Latinx Americanist went down the line and said, well, we don't really study race, but here's what we do study. It was only the Black psychologist who said, I study race. And it made perfect sense because of the way racialization processes play out in different ways. And so I think these differences are important to acknowledge, even as at slightly higher orders of abstraction. Of course, there are similarities across these differences.
And thank you, Dr. Yan. Can you talk a little bit more about the differences in dealing with, you mentioned in your talk with American Indians from a rural perspective versus in urban communities, and sort of that distinction of, it's one thing to provide care within a reservation context versus in urban communities. And can you talk a little bit more about those challenges and sort of reaching American Indians in those respective communities?
Right, yeah. So obviously in most reservation settings, you're going to find concentrations of Indian people who live in the same neighborhood and who are accessing services in, a standard way. Now, there is variation in that too. Some reservations are what we call checkerboarded, where there's a mix of Indian owned and non-Indian owned. And so it kind of depends on some of those aspects. And of course, different tribes have intermarried to different degrees. Here back east, like in New England, lots of the tribes have intermarried with white people and Black people for centuries. So it really is mixed race in many respects in a way that you wouldn't necessarily find to that degree in the West in the larger land-based tribal communities. But nevertheless, you're going to find pockets of Indian people either way who you can serve. In the urban settings, it's really rare to have an Indian neighborhood. People are very scattered. And so what happens is these urban Indian health organizations, which are funded, barely by the Indian Health Service, but which do exist in about 40 different cities, are attraction points and gathering points. So people from all over the city who don't know each other otherwise can meet at these urban Indian centers and health clinics even. And so I partnered with the American Indian Health and Family Services, which is the urban Indian health organization in Detroit, for a couple of projects over my time at the University of Michigan. And while there, that becomes a gathering place. And a lot of what they do is programming that builds a community for Indian people. It's not just about health services. And one of the projects we did together at their invitation was the staff and administrators there were interested in helping urban Indians, those who had been kind of intergenerationally cut off from access to tradition and ceremony and the sacred in terms of indigenous practices. They wanted to make this available through the health clinic for people to access. So we developed an entire curriculum, which we call the Urban American Indian Traditional Spirituality Curriculum, that was designed to reach that swath of the urban Indian population who really had no familiarity with indigenous traditional spirituality. It's kind of like, Indian Religion 101. It's kind of, it has to be like pan-Indian. There are people from 100 different tribes in Detroit, and that's common in all these cities. And so you have to, one of the striking commitments we had for people who wanted to participate was, you have to be open-minded here. You have to be tolerant of other traditions. If you're only interested in your own tradition, it's not going to work. And so that's an example of ways that you can work with, because these centers become sites of community building in a way that's not necessarily in a reservation, because the reservations tend to be much more already sites of Indian community apart from any services that might be offered.
So how do non-native, non-American Indian practitioners or people in general sort of participate in that sort of community building activity with the intent of being supportive, but not wanting to sort of interrupt or take up space, for lack of a better phrase?
Yeah, right. That's always about collaboration and coordination. So, it's obviously you want Indian people to lead the way. In some ways, if there's anything anti-colonial to be taken away from this conversation, it's that the difference between colonial and anti-colonial might not be anything you can recognize from how something what it ends up looking like once you develop something together. It's really the process by which things are developed that makes the difference. So the process is one that Indian people have to be responsible for leading, calling the shots, consulting, giving feedback, deciding the priorities, tailoring outcomes. Whatever it is, it's collaborative and coordinated and a partnership in which expertise is broadly recognized across and between all partners. That's how these things take shape. And so whether the natives have a role to play, non-natives have roles to play usually in these things. It's not about native and non-native. It's more about how do you understand what you have to contribute and how do you engage in partnership, coordination, and collaboration, and particularly if you make your living as a clinician where obviously you're not paid to do that. So, one challenge is if you think that you can become a licensed credentialed clinician, go off and have a private practice and somehow help Indian people, there are limitations when your livelihood depends on, the therapy hour, your 50 minutes, and if you have to do that all day to have the lifestyle you want, yeah, you're pretty limited in what you can do for Indian people. I mean, you can certainly offer therapy, and for that swath of Indian country for whom therapy makes a lot of sense and who are modern and able to live and who embrace and endorse modernist sensibilities in all the usual ways, that's fine. But that's not going to meet everyone's needs. In fact, there's a large swath of people for whom that, again, in terms of psychological mindedness, I don't think most of the world rests in that particular cultural orientation. And I think, whether it's social class, it's gender, and it's race ethnicity experiences, cultural experiences all give rise to whether people are comfortable with what the sciences or the side disciplines have to offer.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat box and the Q&A, and one that's come up a couple times is the use of the term Indian. And I would love to hear your thoughts on, I personally in this discussion have used Native American, Indigenous, American Indian. And what are your thoughts on folks using the term Indian, particularly if you're not Native American, if you're not Indigenous, you're not American Indian? Is that is it a permissible term?
Yeah. So I think, again, like everything I'm saying, you want to follow the lead of your interlocutors, your collaborators, your partners. So this is back to the importance of relationship. The issue here is that in America, we have a problem. We have not just one, but the one I'm going to talk about now is that for Indian people specifically, we're simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. We're everywhere in the sense that there are representations of us that percolate society so that you can't spend one day of your life and not bump into Indian representations. I urge you as an exercise, just take a day and keep track one time. The street names, the names of buildings, things on the map are, of course, one huge way that Indians are represented. But then like consumer products, I think the Land O'Lakes Butter Maiden finally got canceled. But, there's a lot of things like that where you find Indian imagery on products. Then, of course, we have sports teams, mascots. I mean, all of that is pretty prevalent. So, and representations in cartoons. And anyway, so Indians are everywhere in that sense. But those are white man fantasies of Indians or imaginary creative aspects of what white people have thought about Indians or tried to salvage or tried to do. In some ways, that's really crazy because it's erased real Indians. And so, many Americans don't think Indians exist anymore. I mean, obviously, if you're more highly educated and in graduate school, that's not true. But many Americans don't know that's not true. And so and there's not that many of us, as I said, maybe 3.5 million tribal members across the United States. So we can't be everywhere. And so the problem is that we're all saturated in ideas about Indians without even being aware of it, even as we know very few Indians. So but this idea of relationships is kind of important because that's the remedy for that sort of thing. And, even the language you use, follow the lead of the people or the interlocutors, and you can be responsible you're talking to. And some people will tell you, yeah, I don't really use that term. I don't want to. Last time I had all 3.5 million of us in my living room to talk through these issues, we didn't come up to a consensus. So, not everyone agrees on this stuff. But I will say that, why Indian? I mean, because you think, well, Columbus and he was lost and all of that, Columbian legacy. But it's not just that. The Indian is in the Constitution of the United States, and it's in all the very important legal decisions that have protected the sovereignty of indigenous nations in the United States in ways that Indian has been established as a whole branch of federal Indian law. I mean, so we have a stake in this term because of the legal and political status that accords with the founding documents and the guiding precedents of this nation. Native American is a term that you often heard. Native American is not synonymous with Indian because we have American Indians, we have Alaska Natives, we have Native Hawaiians. Native Hawaiians are not Indians, and don't call them Indians. They won't like that. Alaska Natives, some are Indians, but some are Inuit and other kinds of, what we used to call Eskimos. They prefer Alaska Native. So Native American is a broader term that if you're speaking about those three groups, you can usually use as an umbrella term. Although I think there's some Native Hawaiians who may not be that comfortable with Native American even. Once you get to Canada, because we have a lot of exchange across the border, they don't like any of those terms. They use Indigenous now. And increasingly in America, we're using Indigenous, which is even broader. That shows our connection internationally to peoples all around the world, whether it's Japan or Taiwan or parts of Africa or other parts of Asia, in this broad political movement of Indigenous peoples to secure rights and redress from the long legacy of colonization that has pretty much touched all of us. So again, I don't think there's exact ways to be correct in every usage for every person. It floats a little bit, but follow the lead of your interlocutors, try to find out what Indian people themselves think and say, and recognize that there is good grounds for using probably any of these terms. And so none of them are usually technically wrong. It's more about what's comfortable.
Thank you. At the School of Social Work, we talk a lot about decolonizing social work practice. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts when you hear that term even used around decolonizing, whether it's education, mental health services, et cetera. Sort of what's your first reaction to that?
Yeah. My first reaction is to read Tuck and Yang's article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Because
we assigned it to our students this year.
Excellent, wonderful. It's just a fantastically, I love that article. First of all, it's so well written. It's kind of like genius, and it's so politically pure. It's like you could be righteous with that article, even as I'm actually very skeptical that, that kind of return of land and so on is ever going to happen. I mean, settler colonial realities conflict with the impetus to want to embrace and endorse political pureness. But our argument of decolonization is not a metaphor, is that we should only use decolonization with reference to repatriation of indigenous lands and relationships to lands. That is fundamentally about land, and particularly about giving land back that was taken through coercion or other forms of injustice. And that to use decolonization like for the curriculum or for our academic pursuits or our research methodology, that all of that stuff distracts from and actually enables, the very form of escaping one's complicity with colonization and settler colonialism more generally. And so it's a sharp warning. I mean, the other thing that's really interesting about that article is it really points out how, BIPOC or even people of color, these umbrella terms might work for certain kinds of political efforts, but decolonization kind of breaks that open. That if it's really about repatriating indigenous lands, then, your 40 acres and a mule that Black people were promised after the end of the Civil War, actually that's complicit in colonialism because it wasn't, those were Indian lands, at some point that weren't properly, compensated or negotiated in there. So in some ways, immigrant ambitions for finding their way in America, participate in settler colonialism in a way that Tuck and Yang help us to try to appreciate. So, and in some ways, then it's a bid for kind of a primacy of one aspect of indigenous experiences, which is dispossession, and how we became, the floor mat for a colonial project that we now recognize in the United States and Canada and other places. How do we respond in the wake of that? Having said that, I tried my hand recently at decolonization. There's one chapter that a student and I wrote years ago about decolonizing research methods, where we use that term. But I really tried to get at it more substantive. I've avoided it pretty much since then because of the sensitivities around it. I think it'll come out in the new year in the Journal of Counseling Psychology about decolonization as a methodology for counseling psychology in the context of indigenous stuff. And so that I'm trying there to, I think, maybe stake out how I think we can think about decolonization, but it is very land-based in that article, as you'll see when it comes out. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Let me go back to some of our questions coming in from the audience. What are some of the critiques or scientific community pushback that you've heard about the alternative discourses, and how do you respond to those critiques?
Right, so I'll have to try to come up with the critiques myself, because in this day and age, my first faculty job was at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago, I was in the interdisciplinary committee on human development, which was anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, even some biologists on faculty together. It's this great interdisciplinary center of activity in the social sciences. And in some ways that's shaped me. I am an interdisciplinary social scientist in that way. But at Chicago, there was a pretty rigorous culture of like spirited engagement and disagreement and contestation of ideas in the way that scholars have sometimes done in the past. I haven't found that kind of spirited contestation of ideas very often in places I've been since then. And I think it's probably culturally less acceptable now than it was even then to really lay into someone's ideas, because it's taken as an attack on a person, as opposed to a vigorous disputation that will help all of our ideas get better. So I think we take things a little more personally these days, which is why there's sort of less of that. And that's to say then that I don't get to hear too often people, even in peer-reviewed articles, they probably send in to people who are experts in my field who are already, so I don't get some of the stuff that you might expect that one gets in this area. But I can tell you what some of the big ones would be. A couple of my projects really where I find the most satisfaction, they're most important to me, are partnerships with people in Indian communities where we try to work on alternative kinds of services or helping programs together. And what they come up with are things that don't look anything like psychotherapy or mental health stuff. It looks more like cultural tradition and religion is more what it looks like. Okay. But in doing this, the one big challenge is, especially the more local you are, the more you're partnering with someone to develop. In the case of what we developed was the Blackfeet Culture Camp in partnership with folks at the Addiction Treatment Program on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. It's so Blackfeet that you really can't export it other places, and yet it's a small community with, a fixed number of treatment clients at any given time. So the ability to rigorously assess outcomes for a program like this is probably kind of impossible if you're thinking about randomized controlled trials and large enough numbers and samples to do statistics that would help. So I think there are intrinsic trade-offs in some instances between, a deeply embedded anti-colonial or even post-colonial development of programs that would be of interest to Native partners, and the ability to rigorously evaluate it. And I think that would be a huge intellectual fault line, because we live in a world in which the evidence-based practice and all the concerns about our mental health programs running off the rails like they did in the 1990s with the epidemic of multiple personality disorder and recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse and alien abductions and all of that. Our profession, unfortunately, sometimes does run off the rails and people get hurt. So we do want some accountability, something behind, some evidence behind our claims in a way that legitimates or justifies our credentialed knowledge, to use the term that Paul Meehl talked about. Even as we also want to innovate and diversify and consider things that aren't off the beaten path, which require in Indigenous communities small-scale stuff. So, there are inherent tensions there that I think lend themselves to critique or vulnerability. But, we're all very polite these days, and polite people don't directly criticize each other. So what you're most likely to get if people don't agree with you is they'll politely ignore you. But Indian people are so used to that, it's kind of hard to disentangle what's being ignored because of some concern or critique versus what's just, we're not interested, thank you, which is too common.
Yeah, I feel like this inherent challenge of trying to not remain invisible, and while you're maintaining your visibility, to also sort of maintain your roots and your cultural heritage at the same time, and sort of honor that heritage. Another question coming in, do you think individuals such as Traveling Thunder would be more receptive to a Native American service provider, or would there still be a barrier because the service itself comes from the white man?
Yeah. Well, so yes, I do think that would make a difference to people's maybe willingness or ability to try something new and different if it's not even that familiar, and might mute or blunt some of what their concerns might be. Even as, Traveling Thunder himself went on to talk about what you would do, because I asked, okay, so if you're not going to take it, if the clinic is brainwashing, what are you going to do? What do you do instead? And let me just say for you what he said. I'll just give you another quote here. He said, well, you'd probably put up a ceremony and pray for them. There's always a spiritual connection that can help them. When you do that, it depends on your heart. If your heart's in a good place, which, don't mean nothing to a white man, but to an Indian, it means a lot. You pray from the heart. That means sincerity. You really mean it. You have a lot of feelings, a lot of carings for this person. And if you put up the ceremony good, and then the spirits look at you and they say, well, this guy really means it. Let's help him. And they say there's a 50-50 chance that you could get help for that person you're praying for, which would be a lot better help than, locking them away in a state mental hospital. But we had a lot of people that died in that mental hospital, in the past. We got some buried up on the hill here. It was at that era when it was outlawed, against the law, to practice your Indian culture or religion. And there was no spirituality allowed by the United States government or the Catholic Church. So yeah, I would say that's a good possibility. So, there is an alternative here, which is a religious alternative, a sacred alternative that people might prefer even. But honestly, also it's the case that when you're in crisis and suffering, people tend to become more eclectic. They think very practically, what can help me, get past this period of suffering? And so they might try be open to a lot of different things at that time. So I think, again, back to the respect and so on, and having Indian providers, I think will make a big difference in that, even if it becomes kind of a negotiation where, some things that you offer still just don't really reach or just don't make sense. They're just not intelligible. At least there's the benefit that comes from having someone compassionately interact with you and have a stake in your well-being and caring about you, some of those common factors, stuff that we're familiar with.
Thank you. So how can social workers incorporate place in the natural environment into the work that they may be doing with Indigenous people, and more specifically with American Indians in the United States?
Well, I guess first and foremost, you need to know about the place you're in. Which means you probably need to spend some time exploring it and getting to know it and working with partners, collaborators, coordinators, to understand it better. The whole domain of mental health and biomedicine is one in which, we get trained up in how to be a professional, how to engage in forms of professional activity. And then, we're transportable to any system in the country, maybe in the world increasingly. As long as we have the right skill set and the right background, you can slot us in here or there or there or there or there. It isn't anchored to place or space, the spaces are even pretty standardized, like a confidential private room where you can sit and talk, and maybe record something, and where people hopefully don't see who's coming and going. There are things like that even. But so the spaces have some common, but the places are deemed irrelevant almost to how this happens. And yet that's the antithesis of Indigenous traditional therapeutic approaches that often tend to be place and land-based, in which powerful persons who can channel life and prosperity and recovery from illness either live in or perhaps even are certain kinds of landforms in the area, that places can be animate. That the hills are alive in a sense that's more literal than what Julie Andrews was singing in The Sound of Music. So there are aspects to place that can be really important. But again, I think it always mediated by relationship with Indigenous partners, and who can help to teach, orient, and guide what you do and help make sense for what would be things that would matter to do. There's not like the 10 rules I can give you for how to be place-based in your therapy practice. It's because it depends on the local anchor points and partners. The abstractions, although they're useful for us just in getting our thinking, and sometimes maybe illustrations and exemplars are good enough for just giving you even a picture of what it could look like. But the abstractions often are more hindrance than help, because again, it comes back to having relationships with people who can guide you.
And so building on that, I'm curious how you'd recommend, particularly now with this, well, we have multiple pandemics that are intersecting going on right now, but more particularly as we're seeing how COVID-19 is impacting our American Indian communities, and we're seeing a sort of a boom in telehealth. So how do we navigate or work with telehealth to reach our Native and American Indian communities? Or is that even something that the communities would embrace, rather?
Well, talk about placelessness, telehealth and all of this mediated stuff. It just opens up all kinds of possibilities, even as it further distances us or abstracts us from particular places, locales, community settings, and so on. So there's real prospects. Don't misunderstand me, even as though there are other kinds of things that will make a difference in how we think about this stuff. Indian people have been grappling with telemedicine for a long time already. It's not new in the pandemic because, many Indian people live in pretty remote parts of the country. And one problem with service access is even if, like traveling thunder, 65 miles to the agency clinic, if you wanted to go to the behavioral health, that's, and people don't, often are living on the edge economically, don't have a car or a car that's reliable, don't have gas money, so there's those kinds of things where, telemedicine, we have one psychiatrist, this was some years ago now, we had one itinerant psychiatrist for all of Montana, Indian Health. So there's 7 reservations in the state of Montana. They all have IHS clinics, and one psychiatrist would come around. So, you could see a psychiatrist maybe once a month or once every 2 months for medication check-ins and so on. Even as one result is that general practitioners end up being the main mental health providers, because even the psychotherapists in the clinic, of which there's 2 or 3 at a time, they can't keep up with the people who want help. Particularly crisis management is what drives that. So by the time they can even see an Indian person in crisis, the crisis has resolved one way or the other, and then they no longer need their help, So the resources are really an issue. And so telemedicine, telepsychiatry has been one of the things that's been on the radar for a while. But then it's back to the issues of the infrastructure, what kind of internet do you have? How expensive is it to set up a telemedicine consultation clinic? Who's going to pay for that? So it's not impossible, and it's been tried in some place. I think in Alaska, they have probably greater, because of the distances there, or even more than the rest of the continental United States. You can see some of those innovations happen in mental health services in ways that are models. I think that could be useful. But so different communities, I think, are interested in this, but I've not heard too much about where would you find the best models and what specifically do they look like? For psychiatry help particularly, especially counseling. It's one thing to do telepsychiatry, medication consult, but to have like 12 sessions of therapy or just therapy ongoing once a week for however long, interesting.
So how do we address the Darthan resources from a policy or macro level? Because I'm so glad you mentioned infrastructure. I was immediately thinking about, just the lack of internet access, even as we're talking about like schooling, for example, virtual learning, not even around telehealth. But so I'm wondering if you could give us recommendations. A number of our social work students are really interested in doing the advocacy and policy work. And so how do we address those disparities and not just providing the direct clinical care and access, but sort of the macro levels of infrastructure, of access, of resources, of capacity, of people?
Yeah. So once again, I think it's back to partnership and collaboration and supporting Indigenous-led initiatives. So there are all kinds of policy organizations that help to promote policy agendas for Indian communities. The National Congress of American Indians, for example, is like the United Nations of Indian country. It has an office in DC and offices elsewhere too, where, not every tribal community is a member, but a couple hundred are, I think. And they do a lot of policy work and trying to get stuff on the agenda. The National Indian Health Board is another one of these big policy organizations that has representation and ways to try to get priorities from different tribal members and tribal participants to advance a policy agenda. The National Indian Child Welfare Association works on child welfare issues, similar. So we have these established, in some cases long-standing, national organizations that are designed to identify and promote Indigenous concerns and priorities for purposes of policy and legislation and funding and so on. And so I don't think it's not about like what could we come up with that we could then make available for Indian communities. It's already come up with. It's more a question of how can we slot in as partners with these big policy organizations to try to make legislation become a reality, to make adoption of policy a reality. And it's working with them to find out what you have to contribute and what role you could play and what connections you have in ways that can matter. So you're back to, I think, the issue of recognizing that the anti-colonial was really about relationship and partnership and coordination, collaboration. And so it's about how much of this is of interest and commitment enough to you that you can spend some time learning that landscape, learning what those organizations are, finding out, getting involved with those organizations, even on a volunteer basis as a student, because otherwise what happens, which has happened for centuries now, is well-meaning people design things for us that are biased but not for us but not biased. And as a result, they just don't work. They're someone's great idea that is clueless about what we need and about how it should be structured. And we've had so much of that. That's the last thing we need.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have to apologize for making you sort of feel like a broken record around coordination and collaboration. I just feel like the more you say it, the more it will sort of stick with us. So we need to center and honor, American Indian voices and perspectives, and really view our practice, whether it's through clinician, through policy work, through advocacy work, really as a collaborative effort, but really centering the American Indian perspective.
I could just add on to that.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that we keep coming back to it because it challenges our ideas of expertise. We go to places like Columbia University and Harvard University to become to become on a track that gets us to influential areas where we can make an impact. And we want to make an impact. It's good that you're wanting to make an impact, but then it's important to recognize that doesn't mean that the expertise we cultivate is in the ideas that we come up with. The expertise is the opportunity to use credentials and status to heighten, illuminate, and advance indigenous agendas. That's the thing. So it's not about necessarily, sometimes it is, with the partners, you bring an expertise, of course, but it's not that your expertise is autonomous. It's not that our expertise has the answers in a way that no Native person ever thought up. I mean, there's plenty of Native people doing this stuff that these agendas are pretty well informed.
Thank you. One of our guests says, I'm Oglala Lakota, and I've heard recommendations to not work in your community because of too many overlapping identities around community membership, friends, family members, mental health professional, and just to work in other Native communities. What are your thoughts on this as a Native mental health professional yourself?
Yeah, great. I think of square pegs and round holes. I remember when I was a graduate student at Illinois and I was home, I actually got practicum credit to go teach at my tribal college, and that turned into running my tribe as the chief administrative officer for a semester in a summer. And my program let me count that as a practicum. So, there's ways to try to innovate even in those sorts of domains, but I was at home. And my younger brother was going through a tough time. And I remember he approached me one day and he said, here's what's going on. And I don't know what to do. And I'm really at 6s and 7s. And can you do therapy with me? And it took me aback a little bit. And I was trying to think through, okay, what have I been trained? And so what I said is, in our training, we're really not supposed to do therapy when we have close relationships with people. It just doesn't really work. I mean, there are other counselors here, like at the clinic, and he closed down and walked away, and that was it. I think that was a mistake. Right? I was young. I was trying to make sense of something, a novel situation. So I actually think that rising to the challenge of innovating around multiple relationships and all of that stuff is important. The truth is that if you're going to actually get, if you're non-Native, wanting to have greater influence and impact and help and bring greater help to an Indian community, you have to get out of the office and get to know people, which starts to create different kinds of relationships right there that are different than if you're secluded and only know people in the context of a confidential therapy relationship. So what is needed is to get out of that modality and that mentality to actually get to interact with and know people in community. And so the issue then becomes one of how do you manage those relationships? And I think that figuring out how to innovate on the fly in ways that are ethical, but in ways that are off the beaten path and may challenge even some of our ethical prescriptions. Maybe they weren't made for these kinds of situations. Maybe they need to be rethought. So I think that's important to maybe be brave and a little bold and pretty open-minded about how to manage that. So I don't think it means that you shouldn't go to your own community. I actually think there could be a lot gained by going to your own community, although I don't know that means you can work with just anyone. There probably are limitations and boundaries of who you can and can't work with. One other thing I'll say is, when I worked with my Blackfeet partners and we came up with the Blackfeet Culture Camp, You know, it was a pilot thing, and there were not very many clients who were willing to try this kind of experimental thing that we're doing. But it was really led and guided by a Blackfeet traditional society called the Blackfeet Crazy Dog Society. And the crazy dogs vastly outnumbered the clients. We were out going to sacred sites, picking medicines. I mean, there are a lot of things they were doing in this Blackfeet culture camp that was an addiction treatment that looked nothing like addiction treatment. So what was interesting is that, you know, there would be 20 people out on the hill picking sweetgrass or what have you. There was only a small number of them were clients. Most of them were crazy dog members. And people didn't even know who was who. So, you know, that's an instance in which there's kind of a collapse of the usual barrier of confidentiality around who's a client and what they can know. And it's, you know, substance abuse is kind of, I mean, in the Indian community, on the one hand, everyone already really knows who has those kind of challenges and who's in treatment and who's seeing counseling. It's, you know, part of the gossip mill. So it's really not confidential, and so certain details are, of course, but other kinds of aspects are not truly confidential. On the other hand, there's something to be said for engaging with people where those get erased, because then there's not the kind of stigma or the kind of awareness. I think there are interesting things to be explored at this level of boundary and confidentiality and community and connection and embeddedness that is under explored in our profession.
So you mentioned sort of substance use rather being really prevalent, and that's sort of known within the community, but we're also seeing a rise in suicide rates, particularly with teenagers and particularly on reservations. And can you talk a little bit about like how to address that stigma or how to reach Indigenous youth?
Yeah. Well, Indigenous youth have been at increased risk for suicide in our communities for quite a while. It's very hard to intervene with suicide directly because suicide is a very low base rate phenomenon. And so you could adopt almost a pathogen model for how to treat suicide, in which you've got the idea that there's this pathway, a causal pathway that's distinct for suicide, you know, like clinical depression. And so you need to be on antidepressants or getting cognitive therapy or interpersonal therapy for depression, and that can help people prevent suicide. But a different perspective, one that's not like so pathogen focused in the way that biomedicine can be, is to consider broad-based antecedent conditions that put people at risk for a whole bunch of bad outcomes. Suicide is just one of them, but you know, early pregnancy, stopping out of school, you know, getting antisocial behavior, you know, all those kinds of things that our youth could run off the rails in their development and end up involved in stuff that is not considered desirable by their parents or by the community. And I'm sorry for that. I'm just going to ignore it. My crazy phone. And so I think with a broad-based antecedent condition, what you want to actually do is try to figure out how to intervene in developmental pathways in ways that might target all of those things. And you may not actually move the dial on suicide because it's so low base rate, you can't predict who specifically is at risk for suicidal behavior, suicidal activity in a small community, again, where statistics aren't going to hold very well. And so there's a paradox here, which is that suicide itself becomes an elusive target, even though it's an important concern. And so really you can imagine programming that targets all of these things or some subset of them. Maybe it's addiction. The other thing is recognizing that Indian country is a bit distinctive because, you know, as opposed to, you know, a 58-year-old white man who just lost his job, you know, shooting himself, which is a certain modal way that suicide happens in mainstream America. You know, suicide in Indian country, if you were to try about a modality, would be a 16-year-old boy who just had his first girlfriend break up with him and who hadn't thought about suicide much before, but in the wake of heartbreak, which is echoing back to the fact that his parents maybe weren't very able to show nurturing and love when he was young, triggers a kind of a relational cascade and an impulsive attempt to hurt himself. You know, that's a different kind of profile. So you could imagine there might be different kinds of ways to interact with that. One challenge, I think, also is that young people are sorting out who they are and where they belong, what they want to be like. Certainly in Indian country, that's true too. You know, older people, particularly those who have a deep interest in mental health and well-being in Indian communities, tend to think about culture, tradition, ceremony, you know, even as those kinds of things are often the province of elders. So there's kind of a generational disconnect where older people want to see younger people take that stuff up. Young people don't see that as something that's their domain, really. And certainly there are exceptions. There are people who find that or who have been with it the whole time they're growing up, and it's perfect, it works fine. But in terms of mobilizing around it, it can be sort of hard to know how to reach young people. So I think it's important to imagine 1,000 flowers blooming. There's, maybe for one kid it's chess club, for another kid it's basketball, for another kid it's whatever. We want a lot of things that keep people engaged and in sociable, pro-social activities, not anti-social ones. And so I think that thinking broadly about how to engage, honestly, in some of our reservations, just having something to do, something to do when you're outside of school could make a difference in where you're interacting with people, more your own age. Finally, I'd say people like me, I'm too old to work effectively with young people. They can't relate to me and I can't relate to them. So thinking about how do you mediate our services through other young people who then become like peers or maybe slightly older, who can relate well enough, they can translate, they can interpret, they can come up with ideas that make a lot more sense than what I would come up with. So part of it is recognizing the limitations of your cohort and your age and trying to recruit and enlist partners and collaborators who are closer to the folks you really are trying to reach.
Yeah, so reaching partners and collaborators sort of across all identities and age groups. It's not just about looking for your peers, but really sort of the peers of the community or demographic you want to serve, right? One of our attendees is asking, as a current Montana resident, there continues to be a rather stark segregation between Indigenous communities and their neighboring, predominantly white communities. What targeted work can social workers perform in the neighboring white communities to build more space and opportunity for Indigenous cultural growth?
Yeah. I talked about how Indian people have been allowed historically to marry into whiteness, and that is, for example, different in some ways than like the Black community in America. It also means that there are parts of America where Indian people, especially if you're more mixed in your heritage, which many, many Indian people are, and the more you move east, the more you find that as an experience, where Indian people aren't even recognized as Indian, and where if they encounter prejudice at all, it's not going to be prejudice based on our being Indian. It's going to be prejudice maybe on looking a little browner, or in some cases quite brown. It obviously depends on what you present. But I'm routinely misrecognized as Hispanic or Latino. People will talk Spanish to me, and then when I don't answer, it gets awkward because they've made an assumption that is not correct, but then they get offended if I answer in English. So my point of this is that there are parts of America, though, where Indian haters still live. And those people tend to be congregated around Indian communities, because they feel like that these people live off the government. They're just, there's all of the kind of stigmatization and all of the pathologization that plays out in people's attitudes. So I think we're back to the same kinds of questions of how do you ever intervene to alter people's perceptions and attitudes that are deeply biased and errant about other groups of people whom they don't know and whom they've been fed a lot of stereotypical stuff about. And so lots of people who are adjacent Indians think we all live off of government money, that we don't pay taxes, that we're rich from casinos, all kinds of stuff. None of that's true. There are a few Indian communities that are really rich from casinos, but it's very few. And so how do you intervene with that? Well, we could talk about how to develop programming maybe, but I don't even know how you get white ranchers in rural Montana to want to even care at that level. Honestly, the remedy to this sort of bigotry, though, is usually some kind of relationship. So now we're back to relationships, partnerships, collaboration. If you can find ways to get young people, there's more hope for young people than old people who we get set in our ways, right? So, there's no changing someone my age's mind maybe on some of this stuff. But if you get young people together, young people can start to find common. So anyway, I would probably think in those lines, how to think about future generations and how to get relationships happening, because otherwise there might be very difficult figuring out how, even a venue or a forum in which to try to challenge people's stereotypes and misconceptions.
You talked earlier about sort of this disconnect or this tension where the elders in a community want to really use native practices or spiritual practices to address sort of any sort of challenges or problems that folks are having. But then you have the youth who are like, I'm not really connected to that, or that's really the role of the elders. It's not really my role. So how do you, and that's, I think, a unique problem to those living within that community or on a reservation. But what are your suggestions for supporting American Indian folks who may be living in urban communities where they don't feel connected to their cultural roots, but want to build that connection, they want to learn or build on those practices?
Yeah, and that's really common. And that's exactly what led to our developing this Urban American Indian Traditional Spirituality program, which was a stock 12-week curriculum. So, Blackfeet Culture Camp that we developed, as I said, was deeply embedded in Blackfeet notions. I mean, in some ways it was committed to, as they say there, revitalizing the, quote, old Blackfeet religion, unquote. It wasn't even pan-Indian. I mean, Blackfeet have a version of what gets called the Sundance in other communities, but it's not the Sundance. It's the Blackfeet Okan. So there are things that are very distinctive about Blackfeet that then you can, how do you ever scale this up to be able to do an evaluation of the program? Well, one of my responses to that challenge in working with an urban community where there is a lot more prospects for pan-Indian stuff was to, in partnership with this community who wanted a traditional spirituality orientation program, to develop something that was pretty standardized curriculum. It's a curriculum. It has a whole book that has lessons. And in these lessons, there's the script that you follow, and there's slides, and there's pamphlets, and, things that are designed to do this, even as it depends very much on having a man and woman ceremonial co-leader who can run ceremonies, or at least involve someone who does run ceremonies, but they know enough about it. And it involves actual participation in this wet lodge ceremony a couple of times. Again, this is pitched to people who don't have that experience. It's not necessary for people who have that experience. It's for those who want it and don't have it. So, it was an example, I think, of how you can try to reach people with these sorts of things in a programmatic fashion that actually you can imagine scaling this up, because it's a program that could presumably work in St. Paul and in Milwaukee and in Chicago, and because it did draw on Great Lakes-based Three Fires traditions more so than others. So I think that's one example of ways that you can start to do that sort of thing. But that's a formal program. There's other ways, these, as I said, these clinics in these urban centers become more than just health clinics. They become community centers. They become places that pull Indian people together who otherwise are dispersed. And so they already have a lot of programming. They run a sweat lodge ceremony for people who are interested as often as they can. They bring traditional speakers in to talk about culture, history, spirituality at various points, funding allowed. So what would be the number one thing I would do if I wanted to advance that agenda for a particular UIHO, Urban Indian Health Organization? I would give a bunch of money so that they can fund these things and bring lots more people in on a more regular basis, because they're really, really underfunded. And they have the connections, and they have the interest, and they have the dedication to make those things happen if they have the funding.
As an individual, what would you recommend as far as navigating trying to learn about your culture when you're not exposed to it? If you're not growing up on a reservation, you don't grow up in an Indian community, but you really are trying to find that connection to your roots. Is it just as simple as finding the local UHO?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up on my reservation. So what did I do? I went home. And starting in college, I was in the Army for a while, and then I was a cadet at West Point for a while, training to be an officer, and there wasn't room in my Army years to really do that. But I transferred to Harvard as a junior to finish up in psychology, and as soon as I did that, I made it a point to start getting to the reservation, to start getting to know people, start understanding how things worked. And as I said, I had experiences later after that really helped to build that up. I don't think there's any substitute to, quote, going home, unquote. That wherever your home community is or your people, to be Indian is essentially to be a member of an extended family. Indianness is fundamentally about kinship, I think. More so than nation even, although nation is a modern way, we talk about that stuff, but kinship. So it's really about your relatives and where they're from and spending time, putting in the faith, there's going, being, engaging, interacting. And there are times in your life where that's more possible than not. But being a student is a great time because you have more. Let me tell you, as graduate students, that you've probably been told a million times by your faculty, but it's true. You have more time now than you're ever going to have in the rest of your careers, maybe until you retire. So use it.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of us probably don't feel like they have a lot of time. I think we're almost at time. So just my final question is, do you have any closing thoughts or advice for our budding social work practitioners?
Yeah, I think it's a really important time. The pandemic has unsettled a lot of things, and that chaos has harmed some of our more vulnerable communities. I mean, I lost my dad to COVID here a couple months ago. And I don't even know how our little family's going to manage without him. He knew the stuff that we needed to know. So there is a real downside, obviously, to these things. On a more optimistic note, a lot of things are getting reshuffled. There's going to have to be new innovations. Just talking on Zoom like this, I think that we're going to have a different way that we do academia and intellectual exchange in the future because of this experience of the pandemic. That's just one example. A lot of things need to be reshuffled. A lot of things are going to be possible in a way that wasn't before the pandemic, and racial unrest in the wake of killings of innocent Black people, and on the economic catastrophe where there's going to be fallout. So it's an opportunity to be on the lookout for innovations that can make our relevance and our impact and our influence much more widely felt than we had under the old arrangements that can be remade now in the wake of all of this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gahn. Please accept my sincerest thoughts, and I'm so sorry about your loss. But thank you so much for joining us today. The chat box has been a flutter with people being so grateful for your knowledge, your expertise, your information. I think as collectively speak for the Columbia School social work community in saying we are in such gratitude for you joining us, and greatly appreciate the work you've shared here, the references you've been able to trying to share links in the chat box. So thank you again for joining us. And thank you all for attending today's talk. It has been recorded. We're going to have it captioned, and then we'll make available to our Columbia community. So thank you again.
It's a pleasure, folks. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you all some other time.
Yeah, we definitely want to have you back. So thank you again.
Until then, take care.
Bye-bye.